Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Vulnerability Weekly. This show, every week or every 2 weeks, depending on the frequency and the amount of vulnerability we see, we analyze the latest trend and the latest vulnerability across application security, cloud security, container, and infrastructure security. We cover more or less depending on the vulnerability and what's more hot in the market, what's more dangerous in the market, and by time to time, we will focus on specific vulnerability. The show is there to give you a broad spectrum, a broad overview of what's available. We also include weekly posts on our website, www.appsecphoenix.com/vulnerabilityweekly. We intend to give a quick snapshot of the major vulnerability. We don't go in extreme detail on the show on the various vulnerability with the purpose of fundamentally give you a heads up on what's out there, if you have any device, if you missed anything, and that's our mission. So without further ado, let's dive in on this week vulnerabilities. In this week vulnerabilities, we've seen mostly infrastructure, Cisco, DrayTek, and TLC being vulnerable from one or multiple vulnerability on one or multiple product line. And we've seen especially Cisco being attacked and hit by a number of vulnerabilities in the latest 3-4 months with a number of vulnerability from Nexus and so on. This week in particular, their small business appliances and VPN have been vulnerable to a specific vulnerability now disclosed externally, even though there was no particular exploit available. DrayTek is instead a little bit more of a case to look for, because the whole product line, or most of the product line, from firewall to network security appliances, is widely distributed between UK, some presence in US, but mostly Vietnam and Asia. All their appliances have been affected by a number of critical vulnerabilities that allow complete takeover or DNS modification. So it's quite a dangerous set of vulnerabilities. As we speak, there are roughly 700,000 devices across the board, UK, Vietnam, Netherlands, and Taiwan, mostly on the network and infrastructure, but these are the news from Shodan. On TLC instead, those are base stations, those are 5G base station, Wi-Fi manager. We got up to 10 vulnerabilities, of which 3 of them are critical and the other are medium. Now, why they are categorized as medium and actually are medium and critical and actually are true medium and critical, because those devices are Wi-Fi, so they are easily reachable. They are not easily reachable from the web, but the management station are, and they are vulnerable to buffer overflow of authentication bypass, especially on the configuration settings. So enable bypass of fundamentally authentication from an administrator and injection of specific commands to modify the configuration of the Wi-Fi, the password of devices associated. So could potentially lead of man-in-the-middle attack or hijack. And the problem is there isn't a patch available yet, even though we haven't seen exploit in the wild for this particular thing, for this particular vulnerability. Now, on the Cisco side, we saw in the past the Nexus line of appliances being vulnerable to a series of critical vulnerability. Today, we explore a couple of critical vulnerability affecting the small business series router, and specifically the VPN part of it, affecting by denial of service and buffer overflow vulnerabilities. Now, Cisco hasn't disclosed or hasn't seen any exploit in the wild. Nonetheless, because of the exposure of those devices to external connectivity, the attention, especially for small business, should be high. VMWARE, on the opposite side, we covered it a couple of weeks ago, has been on the news quite frequently for a series of critical vulnerabilities, especially for their workspace one and identity management and manager appliances. Today, VMware released a batch of fixes for almost all of their line of appliances, including for the new vulnerability 31656 that is particularly affecting the administration portal and the vConsole, as well as the one access identity management and vRealize automation, sorry. And has advised all their client to update. Now, on the AppSec side, we've seen a little bit less on the application security side this week. Nonetheless, there was a Log4j similar remote code execution for Go and Go parser, URL parser specifically. And this has been a particularly interesting approach because it's a library that is mostly for third-party processing. In the latest release 1.17, the parser has been fixed. And it's particularly interesting, the vulnerability, because fundamentally it's a bypass of the front processing parser, but that then get analyzed on the backend and resemble a lot of similarity with the Log4j issue that was a remote code execution. Even this one is a remote code execution, but attacking Go, that is a particularly newer language and that we haven't seen a lot in the wild in terms of vulnerability. We saw maybe this year one vulnerability affecting Go, but not a lot. So it was particularly interesting. Kudos to Oxeye, an Israeli security company, for identifying this vulnerability. Now, on other news, mostly on hack and data breaches, Slack has been on the news together with Twitter. Slack in particular, because there was a leak of the hashed credential outside, and luckily, Slack has identified quickly that issue and issue a password reset to all the users. So please go in your inbox and check for Slack reset email. They're not spam, they're not social engineering attempt, they're not phishing attempt. Always verify the URL that is a genuine Slack URL. But kudos for Bleeping Computer to raise fundamentally these vulnerability and these issues, and kudos to Slack to jump on it quite quickly. Now, on Twitter land, there was a 0 day some days ago that was actively and effectively exploited. And again, Bleeping Computer has verified that the breach has been done with one of the user posting on social media or posting in dark web forum the credential, and this has been verified with Bleeping Computer. The full article is in there with the detail of the breaches. So Twitter confirms this data breach is true, has disclosed a number of vulnerability, 5.4 million of accounts with credential. So if you have, please take care of resetting your credential. Now, more on the UK side, NHS111, that is our emergency service, has been affected by a cyber attack. Not specifically the 111 service, but more the organization that support and transfer data across the board. There's been, the recovery has been quite quick, but of course, because of the service, because of coronavirus, because of how critical that service is, this has hit the headlight quite much, even though the recovery was quite quick. And again, this is not a cyber attack on the NHS, on the 111, but on the service provider that support the GP and 111 in itself, that that is called it is ADASTRA, quite a complex name. But yeah, without further ado, let's dive deeper into this week Vulnerability Weekly. So as I mentioned, in this week, Vulnerability Weekly, application security and specifically Golang has been in the news. And the particularly interesting part is the parser of the URL parser was actually quite hijackable by a semicolon, and the parsing of this semicolon and the ampersand were actually triggering the vulnerability that fundamentally bypass the front parser and get digested by the backend service. The full detail on our website. As I mentioned, Slack has been sending reset ParseThru to all their users, and specifically just not all of the users, but a good percentage, or 1% almost of their users. So if you see an email from Slack, it's a genuine email. DrayTek has DrayTek, as a particularly complex name, has been affected almost across all the product line, all the 29 models across the boards. The particular series of critical vulnerability allowing completely takeover, changing DNS settings, or redirecting to potentially hijack a DNS setting, and more. I've included a video of the Israeli company that has identified the vulnerability, and a link to Shodan to actually reach and see how many of these devices are out there. Most of them, they are actually UK, Vietnam, Netherlands, and so on. So please update your device. TLC, again, a network appliance that provides web, Wi-Fi, mesh. In this particular location is the mix between Wi-Fi mesh and the 5G base station. They're being affected by a buffer overflow and an authentication bypass of a number of 10 vulnerabilities, which they are true critical, as you can see. So they enable fundamentally somebody to bypass the authentication. And if you see the particularly function that can be disclosed or can be kind of reverse engineered from the name, you can potentially bypass the authentication and modify the setting for the Wi-Fi for the mesh. So if you have any of these devices, unfortunately, there isn't a patch available yet. So consider disconnecting or consider monitoring closely for misbehavior. Cisco has released a patch and has disclosed vulnerability on their small business line of router. And this comes after a series of Nexus vulnerability from last month. Now the small router, the small business router, affecting specifically the VPN functionality of those devices, where fundamentally a specifically crafted input called bypass the authentication and provide fundamentally a root of the underlying system. So 2842 and 2827 has been fixed with the latest release. Now, VMware has released a massive patch of late, fixing a number of flaws on most of their product line. And the patches are available on the knowledge base website of all the product line. So all the version availables, most of all the product line, as I mentioned, and fixing new vulnerabilities, specifically the 31656, that affected a number of their tools that prevents fundamentally authentication and enable an attacker to bypass the authentication and gain admin privilege. So it's a particularly critical vulnerability. Now, most of these devices are actually internal, but the workspace one and some others might be exposed over the web. Moreover, this vulnerability, because it bypassed the authentication functionality, could be particularly critical. So if you have, fix it. On the attack and hack perspective, NHS111, as I mentioned, has been affected by an attack and a quite visible downtime. AS data has the provider that fundamentally covers and provides connectivity to all the 111 service has been attacked by denial of service and a cybersecurity attack. And the attack in itself wasn't particularly dangerous, and there was no data disclosed or leaked. But of course, because of the visibility, because of coronavirus, as I mentioned, the system, that news got particularly attention on. And last but not last, Twitter confirmed a zero-day exploit of one of their vulnerability, where confirmed by Bleeping Computer reviewing the data breach. This has been verified and disclosed by Devil, with almost 5 million of accounts exploited and breached with account ID and more information. You can find all the information about the hack on Bleeping Computer. So you can see there are quite a number of information, almost the full database. So I hope this was useful, and as always, please leave your comments in down below. Let us know which part do you like to focus, which parts you don't care and you want our attention to focus on. And as always, keep attention, attackers are out there. Most of the time, the attack vulnerabilities are being disclosed for quite a long time. So patch, fix, prioritize, and do vulnerability management at scale, because that enables most of your user and organization to actually go and fix and get ahead of attackers and get themselves focused. I hope this was useful. My name is Francesco Cipollone, and this is Vulnerability Weekly. Goodbye. Stay safe.